Shoes. Recorded live.
Hello, everyone. Very excited about the show today. We are talking about B.T.K. With our special guest, Katherine Ramsland. She's an American nonfiction author, professor of forensic psychology. She's written 60 books and more than 1,000 articles, mostly in the genres of crime, forensic science, and even the supernatural. And today, we're having her on to talk about Confession of a Serial Killer, the untold story of the B.T.K. killer. So we're talking about Dennis Rader today. And how you doing, Katherine?
I'm doing well. It's a pretty day here in Pennsylvania, so ready to get going.
I was going to say, I am in Louisville, Kentucky, so it feels tropical right now. I can't describe it any other way. I have another true crime writer that I'm friends with who actually lives here, Kevin M. Sullivan, and he describes it the same way. It is tropical in the summer here.
I thought Kevin lived in Montana.
No, Kevin's a Louisville guy, just like me. He is from the south end of town, and I'm kind of from the east end. But yeah, Kevin, the Bundy expert is what we like to call him. Right. I don't think he'd be offended about that. But yeah, you're the expert on so many different matters. I've listened to you talk about supernatural. I've listened to you talk about, BTK. I've read different books, different articles, all, as many things as I can possibly gather about you. But, rather than I intro you in, maybe you could talk a little bit about your background.
Okay. Well, I'm a writer, but I'm also a full-time psychology and criminal justice professor. So I teach forensic psychology primarily, and I do have a course devoted to serial killers. I've been writing probably almost 30 years now. I just am getting my 64th book published probably this summer, and a lot of it is true crime, but some of it's like journalistic explorations of dark worlds like the vampire subculture, and I've been out with ghost hunters and things like that. How this particular book came my way was very unusual. And I had just written a book called Inside the Mind of a Serial Killer, I think. The Mind of a Murderer, which looked back a century over mental health experts who had taken time to interview extreme offenders, do much more than the typical kinds of short-term assessments, but really spend time with them trying to get a sense of who they were, how they got the way they are, what kinds of things went on in their minds when they were preparing for killing or during their killing or whatever. So I found about a dozen cases of this and built the book from there, and then this book came my way just accidentally. So when Dennis Rader was arrested in 2005, a woman had befriended him. She wanted to write a book with him, and he was interested in that. But then after 5 years of correspondence, she didn't finish the book, and I saw her on Facebook, and I asked her about it because I had heard about it through news media. And she knew who I was because she had a book of mine, and she asked me if I would take over. So that's how it began. Of course, I was ready because I had just written The Mind of a Murderer, where I had looked at and studied in depth how people did this. And I have background in psychology, and I used to be a therapist even. I've written a couple of biographies, so I was ready pretty much for this. I had written many, many, many cases for the Court TV website on serial killers. I knew Dennis Rader's case very well. So I was primed for doing this. I got her letters, 5 years of her letters. I got 5 years of my own letters. I spent time with him every week on the phone. I visited him. I got the police transcripts of his interview, also the video recording, so I could watch his behavior. I talked with the DA at length, who actually had been a friend before this ever came my way. So I got access to a lot of different dimensions and perspectives on him, which went into creating this, what he likes to call his dark autobiography, but I call it a guided autobiography. because I wanted him not just to talk about himself. We have plenty of books like that from serial killers. I wanted him to specifically address things that I thought would benefit the criminal justice, forensic psychology, and law enforcement arena. So I guided him towards specific types of things in terms of his self-analysis, and then the last chapter is really my own overview of it.
Yeah, and that's the thing, you know, with all the things you've done to prepare for something like this, to kind of get thrust in a position where you're actually corresponding with one of these people, is that something that you had done before, or is that portion of it, or was that portion of it completely new to you?
No, I had done it before, but not to this degree in terms of really plumbing the depths of a serial killer's psyche and having, you know, pretty much exclusive access to him, as well as having access to all these letters and documents. And I also had a lot of conversations with the attorney who represented the victims' family members. I spoke to a number of the victims' family members as well. I went to Wichita several times to really, you know, get immersed in it. So I had certainly talked to serial killers or communicated with serial killers before, but this is the first time I had this level of intensity and the multidimensionality of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, with talking to this particular serial killer, did you have to change? Because, you know, a lot of people think that they're all kind of the same thing. You've talked before about the Trinity and how that's not necessarily, you know, always accurate, and he's one of those cases. And so did you have to change up maybe your strategy talking to him as opposed to maybe somebody you had spoken to before?
Well, I mean, obviously we're constrained in how much he can say. So we did use codes, and that was actually the first thing he wanted me to do, because he had this whole set of codes that he wanted to use to speak to me. And so he sent me these little puzzles to solve, which is what I spend the first chapter on, because I wanted the reader to experience, you know, this kind of gatekeeper aspect, that if I first of all wasn't willing to play by his games and wasn't willing to speak with him in codes, it wasn't going to happen. So, of course, I'm going to try. And it was an interesting process, because he sent half of the code to the other woman who had started with him and half to me. So we had to work together to figure out what it was. And he wasn't altogether consistent in what he wanted to do. So it was puzzling, but it was interesting behavior. So one of the things that I'm always watching for is not just what he's saying, but how he's engaged in what he's saying. And that's different from, say, interrogators who really want to mostly hear what he has to say. They're certainly going to watch for deceptive behavior or inconsistencies, but they're not watching the levels of behavior that someone in the field of psychology is going to be watching. So for me, that he wanted to do these codes was interesting. I understood on one level, of course, he doesn't want the guards to see what he's saying, because they could, you know, run and sell stuff online. He didn't want that to happen. So there was that level of probably rational paranoia. But there was another level where he really thought of himself as kind of a spy, and this was a game he played, and it was part of his self-concept. And that was the level that became really challenging for me. But on the other hand, as we worked through his codes and I showed that I could do it and would do it, I then developed a code for us to use for the book. And I used things that I knew would appeal to him, like we used a gardening metaphor. And so I used all kinds of levels of threes, because 3 was a magical number for him. And I used items from things that I had seen in his letters. So I ended up creating the code that we used for the book and that we used to speak on the phone, because we knew that was potentially recorded and could easily be listened to. So that was a very different experience and unusual, but so hopefully the reader will indulge me that first chapter, because I think having that sense of him posing this challenge, my having to get through it in order to work with him, and then my analyzing that behavior. What did it really mean? What did it come down to?
Now, you talked about him kind of seeing himself as a spy, and I've also, in the past read about how he, like many others, was influenced by these old detective magazines. Is that just kind of part of his fantasies with the whole, bind, torture, kill, is that it just kind of developed from an early age?
Well, yeah. I mean, we have really quite a few serial killers, at least, some of the old-timers, like from the 70s, who were highly influenced by these True Detective magazines, because the magazines would pose these front covers that were highly titillating, and so young males emerging into their sexuality were looking at these tied up women or frightened women, or who are provocatively dressed or partially undressed, who are completely under their control. And, for some people, reading that means nothing. It's just, whatever, and they can walk away. Others developed a fantasy life from some of these depictions. Ted Bundy talks about it. I know people dismiss what he had to say, but I think there's no reason to doubt that he definitely began to form his fantasy life off of these magazines, because they were really very alluring. But for Rader, there was one in particular. There were two in particular, but the first one was a True Detective magazine that had published the photographs that a serial killer named Harvey Glattman had taken of the women he had lured on the promise of becoming models for the covers of the True Detective magazines. And he had them get tied up, and then he would take pictures and tell them he was going to kill them. And so the look on their face of utter terror was real. And this imprinted into Rader's young mind at the age of 14, in part because Glattman used ropes to tie these women, and Rader already had developed an erotic fascination for ropes. He would put ropes on him around his waist. He would participate in sort of an autoerotic sense of being tied up, and to the point where he'd lose consciousness and have these hypoxic experiences. So he's got a serial killer who uses rope, who subdues women and makes them completely helpless and under his command before he kills them. The look on those women's faces imprinted on this teenager who's coming into his sexuality, who already feels intimidated by women, who is already thinking about putting them into traps or tying them onto railroad tracks just to keep them under control. Everything converged for him in this image and in this particular serial killer at a fairly young and very impressionable age. So for him, he was already moving in that direction. The magazine gave him everything he needed to now really form his fantasy.
Yeah, and we are kind of referenced Bundy, and we could talk about other serial killers and their influences on him. I know that he was influenced by H.H. Holmes, and ultimately, in a small part, H.H. Holmes kind of led to his downfall and capture. But I always found it strange, and of course you can find this out in the book, that he claims he was not influenced by Zodiac, and I thought that was interesting because a lot of his crimes felt, I don't know, at least some sort of tip of the hat to him.
Well, I think he definitely, because he was reading all kinds of true crime books. Now, when Zodiac happened, he was actually in the military and overseas. But I do think, given all the similarities, like some of the ruses he used and some of the little puzzles and whatnot, I definitely think he read about Zodiac and copied him. And I'm not sure why he's hesitant to say so, because he'll say so about H.H. Holmes, but and he talks about other even novels that he read that he copied the serial killer style or something new that the serial killer did that Rader hadn't thought about. Rader himself isn't all that original. He generally got his ideas from others, and it could easily be he just doesn't remember that. It just doesn't stand out to him, in part because he wasn't